The Thaumaturge is a 2024 story-driven RPG developed by Polish studio Fool's Theory. The Thaumaturge is an interesting game to talk about. An isometric, story-driven RPG set in 20th century Warsaw where you play as a demon-hunting Thaumaturge. It honestly sounds like one of those ideas you'd have between the 4th and 17th beer at the pub, but they somehow made it work. It's a novel, richly detailed game made with passion and care for its subject matter. The kind of game that reinforces the importance of this indie/AA space where creative and truly unique concepts such as the Thaumaturge can come to fruition, as opposed to the AAA space where yeah, let's not spoil the mood by opening that can of worms. So let's jump straight into the game and see what it's about. A special thank you to my friend Gauss for gifting me this game, and to my friend and fellow YouTuber Darzombie, link to his channel in the description, for helping me fact check this video. I also have a Twitter with tweets and a Patreon where you can support the channel with real life money. Let's go!
Mr. Shitsky.
The Thaumaturge takes place in Warsaw in 1905. More specifically, September 1905. This is important to emphasize because September 1905 was a significant date as far as the Russian Empire is concerned. The two immediate major historical events the Thaumaturge draws its stories from are the end of the Russo-Japanese War, which took place between February 1904 and September 1905, and the 1905 Russian Revolution, which, as of the events of the game, is ongoing and causing massive social and political ripple effects throughout the Russian Empire. One of them being the revolution in the Kingdom of Poland, which started in, you guessed it, 1905. So why is that revolution important to the game's plot? Well, if, unlike me, you actually paid attention in class instead of skipping school to play dice in the back of the bread delivery truck that supplied the grocery store next to the school, you might already know of the partitions of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the late 18th century. To cut a long story short, it was a series of territory annexations and seizures which saw the Habsburg monarchy, the Kingdom of Prussia, and the Russian Empire dividing the former Commonwealth lands among themselves. To give you an idea, here's the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1772 before the partitions, and here's how it looked after the big boys were done coloring the map. We're not done yet. Naturally, following the partitions, Poland and Lithuania ceased to exist as sovereign states. As of the events of the Thaumaturge, the Kingdom of Poland, or Congress Poland, or Congress Kingdom of Poland, is not exactly a state but a mere polity, a sort of successor to Napoleon's Duchy of Warsaw, established at the 1815 Congress of Vienna, when the French ceded a chunk of their Polish territories to the Russian Empire following France's defeat in the Napoleonic Wars. So the gist is that while the Russian Empire liked to project the image of a semi-autonomous Kingdom of Poland with the capital in Warsaw, in reality it was... wow, my voice is... So the gist is that while the Russian Empire liked to project the image of a semi-autonomous Kingdom of Poland with the capital in Warsaw, in reality it was nothing more than a puppet state in a personal and real union to the Russian Empire, whose already symbolic autonomy was progressively restricted throughout the 19th century through a series of quote-unquote administrative reforms. And this massively abridged version of history serves as the political and social backdrop of the Thaumaturge's narrative. The Russian Empire, led by Tsar Nicholas II, seen here 13 years prior to being Bolshevik, is bursting at the seams. Desperate to re-establish control and struggling and failing gloriously to contain the revolutionary fervor sweeping the empire. Meanwhile, Poland has had enough of the Tsar's bullshit and is ready to break away from the empire by any means necessary. Warsaw, ripe with political tensions, is a hotbed for grassroots independence and labor rights movements and covert revolutionary activity. Meanwhile, the Ochrana, the Russian Empire's secret police, is dispatched to deal with revolutionaries and so-called enemies of the state. And the cool thing is that you get to participate in these events, both directly and indirectly, because you kinda have a personal stake in them. But the history stuff is just one layer of the Thaumaturge. You are
Wiktor Szulski, Wiktor Szulski, Wiktor Szulski, Wiktor Szulski.
A young bourgeois gentleman that returns to Warsaw to investigate the mysterious death of his father. Wiktor is not just any silver spoon kid. He comes from a long line of Thaumaturges. Thaumaturges are a type of psychic wizards who are gifted, or cursed depending on who you ask, with the ability to perceive and harness the traces of emotions and feelings people unconsciously leave behind. The way I understood it, the collective psychological activity coalesces into a hidden reality that only thaumaturges are able to perceive. So by simply touching a mundane object, a thaumaturge can discern the owner's feelings, emotions, motivations, insecurities, personality, and so on. Think of it as mind reading by proxy. To thaumaturges, us normal people are basically human-shaped snails that produce infinite slime trails of emotions. Now here's where it gets interesting. There's another layer to thaumaturgy that concerns the symbiotic nature between human flaws and the demonic realm. These demons, called salutors, attach themselves to a person's defining flaw, causing them to act erratically. Thaumaturges, through a mixture of occult detective work and a bit of psychological fuckery, can remove that flaw and assimilate its corresponding salutor for their own benefit. The kicker is that by having that flaw removed, the individual is irredeemably changed. For example, say your defining flaw was the obsessive pursuit of turning a hobby into a full-time career to the detriment of everything else, your social life, family, whatever. Now, if a thaumaturge were to remove that flaw, your life would be objectively improved, but you'd lose the passion for that hobby. And to the game's credit, it does a great job of exploring this moral dilemma with nuance. It has no qualms calling out thaumaturges for exactly what they are, because let's be frank, their motives aren't exactly altruistic. Like, okay, Victor rids Warsaw's nightlife district of a salutor that thrives on bar fights and deadly drunken antiques, but you know, he also got to capture a powerful demon. It just so happens that Victor's quest to capture as many salutors as possible has a net positive impact on public safety. Now, to be absolutely fair to our dashing protagonist, there's a good reason why Victor is so hell-bent on capturing salutors, and I'll try my best to explain this without giving away too much of the story. See, thaumaturges are not perfect. They have flaws too, and Victor's flaw happens to be his pride, which also plays a mechanical role that we'll touch on later. Individuals with thaumaturgic sensibilities are found by their salutor early in their lives, at which point they need the guidance of an experienced thaumaturge to tame the salutor. Otherwise, they go insane. Victor didn't receive his thaumaturgic education because he was kicked out by his thaumaturge father 15 years prior to the events of the game. And this is actually where the game starts, with Victor seeking and receiving the help of none other than fucking Rasputin to tame the salutor that had chosen him once his defining flaw had manifested. Yeah, Rasputin is a main character, this game doesn't fuck around. So, to summarize, what we got here is a game with a historical, hyper-localized setting with heavy supernatural elements, as well as a story that explores the moral and ethical implications of thaumaturgic practices. And as if that wasn't enough, there's this additional political layer to the story that deals with the decay of the Russian Empire and the state-sponsored atrocities committed by said empire, socialist and labor rights movements, far-right agitators trying to co-opt the fledgling Polish independence movement. This game does a lot of things story-wise. Let's not forget about the demons. My god, do these demons look fucking awesome. Wait, what the
Found you at last. God damn it. I'm gonna get that raccoon. The hell is this? European history. Fucking politics. In games. My rodent, you know there are demons in this game, right? Ay, what is he subjecting you to? God damn it, even his chair is more comfortable than mine. Well, since I'm here... Name's Arkham, and I'm hunting raccoons. But also, I absolutely love mythology and folktales. For those that don't know, I live in Japan, and a big part of my interest in this culture is my fascination with Asian myths and legends. Oh, and waifus. I'm especially interested in how our modern ideas of supernatural beings evolved out of various stories being combined into their contemporary form. For example, Victor's lifelong companion and all-around pride junkie Upia. By the way, this is an incredible creature design. Despite having no discernible facial muscles or animations, he's able to communicate so much just by cocking his head and smashing that cane of his into the ground a few times. But how about that name? Upia. Sound familiar? Maybe take a look at the letters. Boy, that sure does look like the title of a certain Don't Nod game that me and the raccoon like. That's right. This is one of the original spirits that was smashed together with various others to create the modern romantic vampire.
What is darkness but lurking sun? What is wall but enslaved stone? What is glass but tortured sand?
The difficult part about dealing with Slavic mythology, though, is that first, Slavs are not simply one people or one culture. We're talking about a whole language family here. And Slavic pagans didn't really write down their stories themselves, preferring sharing them orally. But you know who did write things down? That's right, the Catholic Church. And to say these guys had an agenda when they talked about pagan beliefs is putting it mildly.
Down with the evil spirit. I drive you out in the name of Christ.
Both Veles and Morana are actually gods, which to me implies that the shapes Salutors take are affected by our expectations of them. I mean, we can't really assume Victor is walking around with pagan gods on a leash now, can we? Even so, Veles is considered to be one of the most powerful gods in Slavic paganism, with dominion over earth, cattle, and peasants, and is sometimes portrayed as a dragon, which may explain this interesting representation of him here. Morana, on the other hand, is a pagan goddess of death and rebirth, and specifically the seasonal change from winter to spring. A late Happy Easter to everyone, by the way. It's a wonderful time of the year here with the cherry blossoms blooming. Pagan gods were just personifications of seasons and weather, and in some cases natural disasters. They are clearly man-made stories conjured to give meaning to all the unknown things in the world around us, and to try to teach children the dangers of the world, and how to love, respect, and accept the ever-changing nature of it. This is also something that's a part of Thaumaturge too, and is emphasized by the floor system in the game. These creatures aren't just floating around causing trouble, they're specifically attracted to human traits, often considered negative, that have been inflated to excess. The Salutor is drawn to them and they begin a vicious cycle of fanning the fires of the floor, causing the victim to act upon it and thus making the floor stronger and the consequences of it greater. The symbolism is hardly subtle, but the point is that the real demons are things that exist within us, not outside of us. It's by becoming enslaved to our vices that we invite the devil in, so to speak. Fool's Theory drew on a variety of resources for their mythological beings though. The obvious standout is the Jinn, who I'm sure we all know from Aladdin and quite possibly The Last Wish if, like me, you're something of a Witcher fanboy. This popular version though is also something of a collection of Arabian myths and legends that goes back even before the rise of Islam. The Jinn were invisible spirits, and while it was believed that most weren't interested in human affairs, some were considered malevolent and were charged with all sorts of crimes such as diseases and mental illness. Krampus is also somewhat different from the others in that this particular story is considerably more contemporary than most of the others, and much like its red-suited other half, has been significantly transformed by popular Western culture. Krampus is more of a cautionary tale than something to make sense of a senseless world. Almost every culture all over the world has a creature that takes naughty children away from its parents, or doles out some terrible punishment far beyond what exhausted adults could administer after a full day of trying to etch a living out from the mud. So sure, if you aren't good, then St. Nick isn't going to bring you a toy. But in some harsher regions of Europe where winters were longer, colder, and food could grow incredibly scarce, disobedience came with the added bonus of being thrashed with a switch by this monstrosity, or even being spirited away to hell by it. There are some ideas that Krampus is actually connected with old Slavic paganism, but these claims are unfounded, and were apparently socialist propaganda against Christianity that was even bolstered by the Nazi Party, which may make this guy the only creature in the game to have actual demonic backing. So this has been very brief, I know, and I'll definitely talk in a little more depth about Upia in my own video on Thaumaturge. But if you're interested in this stuff, then please go check out the Monstrum segment of the Storied YouTube channel. It's really interesting. Now, what else can I talk about before I go looking for that rodent to get... God damn it, I just had these new lag augmentations installed.
In terms of presentation, the Thaumaturge is one of those weird cases where the game does as many things right as it does wrong. I'll return to this point later. Let's start with positives. For one, Warsaw is an absolutely gorgeous space to explore and experience. There's a lot of detail and care put into the game's indoor and outdoor spaces. Let's start with Warsaw, which is a character unto itself. The streets are brimming with activity and lots of visual and sound flourishes. The hum of a passing tram, the hustle and bustle of an outdoor market, street musicians playing the hits. What's more, there are several districts available, each with its own distinct visual theme. The Jewish working class district of Miro, suburban Powązki Cemetery. There's a lot of variety and architectural eye candy to enjoy. According to an interview with developer Fool's Fury, Warsaw was chosen because of the team's familiarity with the city, and it really shows. I love to see the photos and documentation the team used as reference because man, these spaces feel uncannily on point, like so intuitively right. I don't know exactly how to express this. It feels like a city that has grown organically over the years, if that makes any sense. See, Warsaw experienced massive economic growth throughout the 19th century. Now, European cities of that era didn't exactly plan growth or zone areas for specific purposes. They pretty much built shit wherever they saw fit. I'm sure there were exceptions, but whatever, I'm not an urban planning history YouTuber. Anyways, in-game Warsaw's urban design, or lack thereof, with its winding streets, asymmetrical layout and mixed zoning, really sells the idea of a city that has only recently started developing. As for indoor spaces, they too are bursting with personality and feel lived in. There's just something super satisfying about zooming in and seeing a realistically untidy desk. It makes me feel seen, you know? There are too many individual locations to highlight, so I'm just gonna stick to a few. The Szulski's family antique shop, for example, looks decisively cluttered and chaotic, as you would expect from a business whose incentive is to sell an ever-expanding inventory of random trinkets. Then there's the London bar, a shady dive that your friend, romantic mobster/poet Aborici modeled after a typical pub from its namesake city. And look at this Georgian village inn. So much detail. I could stare at these spaces for minutes and not get bored. The Thaumaturge is just a visual treat through and through. Whether you're a sucker for realistic urban spaces or pretty architecture, there's something for everyone to enjoy here. Now, the score too is something to behold. Composed by names on the screen because I don't want to embarrass myself. According to the Steam page, the score draws inspiration from early 20th century Warsaw's ethnically diverse landscape, and yeah, that description is pretty much on point, as each district has a specific musical theme capturing its cultural flavor. Lush, eclectic instrumentation, dreamy, catchy vocal loops, dramatic dark cello sounds. It's one of the best video game soundtracks to come in recent years. If you enjoy the dramatic, larger-than-life melancholic intensity of, say, Olivier de Riviere's score for Vampire, you'll feel right at home in the Thaumaturge. There's one particular track that I'm really obsessed with, mainly because it has this rhythmic, low-intensity whistling sound like shh, 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 shh. I'm gonna play that clip and then several other soundtrack snippets, so let's have a listen. Now, as much as I love the game's visuals and soundtrack, there are a few quirks that I have to highlight. In the technical department, I noticed a few visual bugs that grew in intensity and frequency as the game progressed. Mind you, these bugs might be squashed by the time this video drops, but I had to mention them just in case they're not. I also noticed that the transitions between cutscenes in the game world are too abrupt in places, resulting in the fade-out effect cutting over the speaker's last words. Also, the voice acting is kind of all over the place. It's far from bad, mind you. It's more a case of maybe this line needed a few more takes than, oh my god, this is truly immersion breaking. Kinda like my videos. So yeah, the Thaumaturge is a tight, very artistically accomplished video game. But that's not everything this game has to offer, so let's move on to the meat of the game, the choice-driven gameplay and the story.
99 bottles standing on the wall.
Hey!
The Thaumaturge is a choice-heavy narrative RPG mixed with turn-based combat and detective mechanics. Normally, I'd call them gameplay layers, but in the Thaumaturge's case, they're connected in some pretty interesting and unexpected ways. Let's start with the progression system. So as you explore the world, pick up clues, solve quests, interact with things, and so on, you start earning experience and Thaumaturge points. You can spend these Thaumaturge points on one of the game's dimensions, which correspond to heart, deed, mind, and word. Progressing through these dimensions gives you access to combat abilities and modifiers to those abilities. This also increases the stats specific to those dimensions, which are required to unveil specific clues. For example, in one quest, I needed a mind stat of 6 to unveil a certain clue and progress to the next phase. But since I was just below the stat requirement, I had to temporarily pause my investigation and return once my mind stat was high enough. Granted, this happened only once in roughly 40 hours of game time. I was able to progress through the game's content organically without encountering any stat-based blockers, so the game is pretty well balanced in this regard. Circling back to the dimensions, how much you progress through them is locked off by the salutors you have captured. There are 2 per dimension, making a total of 8 salutors. You unlock the first 4 salutors, Upir, Veles, Bukavak, and Lelek, through the main story, so they're essentially unmissable. However, the final 4 salutors are very much missable. Some you come in contact with via the main story, while others are more obscure. Whether those salutors are worth pursuing is up to you, though it's worth noting that the game gates narrative choices and content behind the salutors you have found. For example, if a dialogue choice requires a hard stat of 7, you need to have captured the second salutor tied to that dimension and progressed further through that skill tree in order for that dialogue choice to become available. So yeah, even if the final 4 salutors are technically optional, you may want to capture them anyways to experience as much content as possible. Plus, let's be honest, why would you not want to snatch them? I mean, look at these fucking things, they're so freaking cool. As a side note, another aspect that I appreciate about the Thaumaturge is that it's very transparent in regards to how it approaches choice, so you always know why specific narrative avenues are available or not. To give you just a quick example, previously I talked about Victor's flaw, pride. Fueling this flow by choosing prideful dialogue options fills up an invisible meter that, once past a certain threshold, blocks off non-prideful options. Similarly, some dialogue options will be unavailable if your pride is too low. Like, I'm not pulling this out of my ass, the game literally tells you that your pride is too low or high for certain responses. Now, the bulk of the game consists of exploring Warsaw's many districts, picking up quests, and tracking and solving investigations. As I mentioned earlier, Thaumaturges are able to sense the emotions tied to an object, which is how they figure out the thoughts, feelings, and motivations of the individual that came in contact with it. There's actually a very cool scene where a high-ranking member of the socialist movement brokers a meeting between Victor and a fellow Thaumaturge in hiding by ferrying a series of mundane objects between them. I should have led with this example instead of wasting space with those long-winded explanations, but whatever. Anyways, a significant chunk of the gameplay revolves around this investigation method. Victor uses his supernatural perception to sort of follow the emotional breadcrumb trails leading to the main objective of the investigation. Whether it's settling a labor dispute between some construction workers and the foreman, piecing together the chain of events that caused the night of drunken antiques to turn deadly, or tracking down the person that the salutor has attached itself to. This is where the flaw mechanic comes in. As you encounter people with flaws, you can assimilate the flaw and the salutor tied to it, or choose not to, but again, the game offers no mechanical incentive to not just take the salutor and be on your way. Of course, there is the whole moral dilemma of assimilating someone's flaw and thus stripping them of their main drive in life in the name of public safety, even if said drive is fueled by a parasitic demonic entity that causes them to act erratically. But I really need that stat increase to track down a secret cigar club, so maybe try getting your own personality next time, okay, Dennis? Now, beyond pursuing salutors and specific quest objectives, you use this perception-based investigation method for pretty much everything else. You basically examine objects to discover tidbits of info about characters, lore, stuff like that. These parts are not voice acted, but the prose is concise and snappy, so I don't think it's too much of an issue for players who don't necessarily enjoy reading text in their video games. However, I can totally see this unveil clues to form a conclusion loop becoming repetitive for some players, but on the flip side, the game offers enough variety to compensate for this potential shortcoming. As for the combat, it's quite fun, but it won't blow people away either. Combat takes place between Victor, his Salutors, and human foes in a turn-based system that I've seen compared to Pokemon and Persona. I've never played a Pokemon or Persona game, I know. Shocking. So I'm going to judge the combat system on its own merits. Total, you can have up to 8 Salutors, and you can use all of them in combat. Each Salutor has a suite of abilities themed around the human flow they represent, as well as a specific combat role. Whether it's breaking enemies' focus, dealing damage over time, interrupting or delaying attacks, and so on. Each action takes a certain amount of time displayed in the timer at the top of the screen, and comes into effect in the next turn. You issue your, meaning Victor's, actions independently from whatever Salutor you have chosen. It's also worth pointing out that upcoming enemy actions are also displayed at the top of the screen next to the timer. That said, I think you've already worked out the combat's main gimmick based solely on that information. Basically, all the combat comes down to is dealing as much damage as possible during your turn by figuring out the best synergies between Victor and his Salutor's abilities. For example, one of Bukavak's abilities, Bloody Wedding, deals 8 damage for each enemy affected by the Suffering State, a damage over time ability that can be cast by both him and Victor. You can also intentionally stack up enemy inflicted debuffs like bleeding and then have Lelek transfer them to the strongest enemy, and so on and so forth. There's a decent amount of fun synergies and builds to experiment with. And trust me, experiment you will, because the game has a mechanic designed specifically to encourage players to swap Salutors. From the moment you enter Act 1, you will start encountering enemies with traits, and man, here's a piece of advice. Don't underestimate traits, they can become a huge pain in the ass. The most common traits are various forms of resistances, like for example partial or full resistance to Victor and his Salutor's attacks. Other enemies may have some sort of bonus, like health regeneration every turn. You can remove traits by attacking the enemy with a specific Salutor, meaning the one from the same dimension as the trait. For example, if the enemy's trait belongs to the war dimension, you can remove it by attacking with Velis and Krampus. You don't need to use offensive abilities to remove traits. Any ability works as long as it's from the appropriate Salutor. Now, there is more to the combat than simply dealing damage. See those little yellow dots above the enemy's HP bar? That's their focus level. After the enemy's focus is reduced to 0, they suffer the breakdown status. When an enemy is suffering from this status, they cannot take any actions and can be targeted by strong attacks, sort of like ultimate abilities, both by Victor and the Salutor. There are multiple ways to reduce an enemy's focus. For example, you can apply focus reducing modifiers to Victor's abilities, or use Salutors specifically designed to target focus, like Lelek and Morana. Regardless of how you go about this, make sure to always use strong attacks as soon as they're available, especially the ones that regenerate your HP, like Opiers, because there's no straightforward healing spell. Yeah, you heard right, healing is done indirectly through specific Salutor abilities. Wrapping up, it's a really neat system and I had a ton of fun looking for cool synergies to wipe enemy focus before their turn had even started. And that's the combat in a nutshell. It's not bad by any means, but if you're looking for deep strategic combat, there are a lot of turn-based games that scratch this itch better. For me, seeing the Salutors in action was by far the highlight of the combat. Each Salutor has a set of unique attack animations that I was genuinely looking forward to seeing whenever I was pulled into combat. In fact, the cool Salutor animations is why I refused to crank up the combat speed in the options menu. This takes us to the final section of the video, which is going to address the writing, characters, side content, and everything in between in one big pile. So besides Victor's immediate family/friends, meaning his sister, maternal uncle, and his gangster/poet best friend Oborichi, you will interact with a multitude of people from all strata of society. This diversity of social and economic backgrounds not only enriches this game's interpretation of Warsaw as a setting, but it also makes sense in relation to Victor. See, Victor himself is something of a social chameleon, but not for the reasons you'd usually attribute to this personality type. Due to his background, Polish father and Russian mother, and being kicked out of the house as a teenager, Victor doesn't really fit anywhere. He is an educated, moneyed member of the bourgeoisie, but his honesty and distaste for court intrigue and gossip make him unsuited for Warsaw's high society. Victor carries himself like an aristocrat, but he never shies away from the occasional pub brawl if need be. He enjoys fancy wines and old imported American whiskey, but he'd much rather spend the night chugging gallons of vodka in a shady dive in one of Warsaw's working working class districts. He's very street smart, he knows how to handle himself at high society functions, but look close enough and you'll detect a tinge of awkwardness in his demeanor. You can tell he doesn't feel at ease. Also complicating things is his status as a thaumaturge, a, let's call it, demographic that's equal parts respected and despised by the general public. Thaumaturge's supporters admire them for their perception and problem-solving skills. Because, you know, a highly trained thaumaturge can solve a murder in half the time it would take a cop. That's just one example, I'm sure there are many other use cases that I can't think of right now. Now, detractors are at best skeptical of their thaumaturgic abilities, calling them charlatans and snake oil salesmen, and at worst absolutely fanatical in their belief that thaumaturges are scheming parasites that should be eradicated. So, yeah. There's that. Victor is a very complex and well-written character and I enjoyed the time I spent with him. Moving on to the side content, there's quite a lot of high-quality stuff to enjoy here. Side quests are a great opportunity to explore this game's interpretation of Warsaw as a setting. These side quests range in tone in that there's a good mix of serious, politically charged stories dealing with Warsaw's political tensions, Russia's oppressive grip on Polish society, and quests that are more lighthearted. For example, there's a quest line involving the so-called Flying University, a progressive space where women and marginalized people gather to exchange ideas, debate art and politics, and take the first steps towards developing a higher education. The quest starts innocent enough, with an invitation from your sister Ligia to participate at a lecture she is to host at the local bookshop, and a not-so-subtle shove to go pick up some donuts from their childhood favorite patisserie. Great, nothing wrong with having a donut and discussing the latest, I don't know, Jack London book, right? Wrong, duh. The Tsar doesn't like women and poor people having opinions, so the budding progressive space is under constant watch by the Ochrana. So you can be a good brother and help the budding progressive space, or be an asshole and derail it. One thing that I forgot to mention is that you can sort of shape Victor's character with your choices and quests and conversations beyond the pride mechanic I mentioned earlier. This quest is a great example of the way the Thaumaturge approaches choice, because Victor's actions in this quest have both political and personal ramifications. But that's all I'm willing to say about this quest for now. Apart from, let's call them primary side quests, the Thaumaturge offers an additional category of side missions called Urban Secrets, basically collectibles meant to flesh out the lore and history of the setting. In each of them, you'll have to use your thaumaturgic abilities to find their trace and location. Now, they are not essential, but be warned that there is a salutor hidden behind an urban secret, so keep an eye on it. And that's a wrap on this video. The Thaumaturge is exactly the kind of game I want to see more of in this cursed industry landscape marred by corporate greed and unnecessary layoffs. I don't want hyper-realistic graphics and hundreds of hours worth of bloat designed by overworked and exploited developers. I want medium-sized games with creative gameplay concepts and settings developed on reasonable budgets by passionate people. The Thaumaturge stands as proof that there is a demand for these games, and I highly recommend you pick up this gem. Please buy it, it's so good. Thanks for watching. As always, a special thank you to my wonderful patrons whose generosity makes these videos possible. I'll see you next time.